a Nuzlocke, any Pokemon that faints is boxed forever, and you only get to catch the first encounter in any area. But what if all those encounters were randomized? And on top of that, what if every gym leader in Johto had a team full of legendaries? I'm totally screwed, aren't I? Regardless of the impossible odds we have to go up against, we need to pick a starter Pokemon, and the randomized selection is insane. Bagon, Larvitar, and Bulbasaur are all phenomenal Pokemon in their own right, but I have to go with my favorite of the three, Larvitar. And just like all the Pokemon, all the abilities have been randomized as well. And Water Absorb is crazy powerful for Larvitar, making one of its quad weaknesses an immunity. But our good fortune doesn't quite stop there, as I run into a Whismer on Route 29, and I know what you're thinking, Whismer, that thing sucks. But this isn't just any Whismer. Bernadetta is pure power. But she's not the only addition to the team. I find a Pichu with Shadow Tag, which is a lot less impressive. Speaking of which, in the Dark Cave I run into a Wynot, which of course doesn't have Shadow Tag, making it a lot worse than it usually is. Finally, I pick up one last encounter before entering Violet City, and it ends up being a Torchic, which has Stall, making it crappier than Floatzel's Mudshot animation. And so, after picking up a Focus Sash, I'm ready to take on the first gym leader, Faulkner. Okay, ready's a bit of an overstatement, since I'm about to take on legendaries with a team looking like this. And right off the bat, we're in massive trouble as Faulkner sends in the legendary bird Articuno, which isn't good for our ground-type Larvitar, so we immediately have to swap out, sending in our terrible Torchic. A Powder Snow barely does anything on the switch, and for whatever reason, Articuno starts spamming Endure, allowing Torchic to actually pick up the KO. Wow, you actually did something. We do then have the type advantage versus Registeel, but Torchic just gets stepped on and flinches. So I of course have to swap out without getting any damage on the Registeel at all into my Wynot. The Registeel then hits me with a Metal Claw, which I can at least start resisting with my color change ability. This means the next one does substantially less damage, and to make sure we're going to continue to take that little damage, I go for an Encore, locking it into Metal Claw. Then to continue ensuring we're going to take less and less damage, I fire off a couple of Charms to lower Registeel's attack. But since Wynot can't do any damage of its own, I swap out into Pichu, who doesn't take too much from the Metal Claw after the Charms. I then realize I can barely deal any meaningful damage myself, so I opt to paralyze it with Thunder Wave before Registeel steps on me again, getting a critical hit and taking out my Pichu. With the Registeel paralyzed, however, I decide to try for a Paraflinch strategy and go for Bite to see if I can get the flinch, but it barely does any damage, and Metal Claw actually does a ton even at -4. So I figure my best course of action is to send in Wynot to further lower Registeel's attack, but it ends up getting a critical hit again and boosting its attack. So my plan to lower its attack completely backfired. From here, things are not looking good. Roy always moves last, so I'm gonna have to face the full power of a Stomp, which it actually survives and managed to fire off a critical hit Ember. Excuse me, how are you actually being useful? Yeah, that's more about what I was expecting. With 60% of my team lost, I'm down to just Larvitar and Whismer. And despite being an insanely low power move, at least Astonish can pull off some flinches, which combined with a few turns of paralysis is actually enough for Bernadetta to take out the Registeel and grant us our first gym badge, at the exceptionally high cost of most of my team. So we're just gonna have to go and find ourselves some replacements. The first of which being a Nidoran male with Leaf Guard. Then from the Ruins of Alph, I pick up a Lombre with Reckless, which it doesn't get any use from at all, apart from like Double Edge. In Union Cave, I run into a Togepi with Bad Dreams, which, you know, the life as a Togepi seems like kind of a nightmare. Then just outside of Azalea, I pick up a Riolu with Rivalry, which admittedly doesn't do anything against most legendaries. However, since the last two Pokemon I picked up evolved through Friendship, I can immediately get myself a Togetic and Lucario. And because the level cap is at 17, Nidoran evolves into Nidorino, which means that no matter how much I don't want it to be, it's time to take on the second gym leader, Bugsy, who starts out with a Raikou, so things are already not looking too good. It starts by going for Leer, however, and since its only physical attacking move should be Bite, which I quad resist, I'm not too afraid of that. I then end up getting a Paralysis with my first Force Palm, allowing me to outspeed the next turn, taking Raikou deep into the red and activating its Citrus Berry. It then goes for Thundershock, impressively taking out a third of my health. I fire off another Force Palm, taking the Raikou Ho-Oh into the red, thinking that I'm just going to be able to take it out with another one, but in true gym leader fashion, of course Bugsy heals up to full with a super potion. Now in range of being taken out by a Thundershock, I swap out into Larvitar, but the Raikou just gets paralyzed. I fire off a Rock Slide, hoping that I can maybe get a flinch, and I actually manage to get it twice in a row. Then, not wanting to risk Rock Slide's accuracy, I decide to go for a Bite, which doesn't quite get the KO, but I end up getting the third flinch, so one more bite takes out the Raikou. Bugsy then has what's usually Larvitar's absolute worst nightmare, a Kyogre, but since we've got Water Absorb, I decide to stay in, and it goes for a Body Slam, which deals a massive amount of damage through a critical hit. So after lowering its defenses with Screech, I'm not sure if I can take another regular Body Slam, so I swap out into Lombre. However, I could have easily stayed in and gotten some damage on it since it goes for a Water Pulse. Kyogre is a huge threat to the team at this stage in the game, even with just Body Slam, so after getting some chip damage with Fake Out, I decide to fish for some status with a Nature Power Tri-Attack, but it doesn't end up happening. Which means unfortunately, Lombre gets destroyed the very next turn by a Body Slam. Then to try and succeed where Lombre never could, I send in Togetic, who can easily tank a Water Pulse and fight back with a Yawn. It can then survive another Water Pulse the next turn and go for a Charm to lower Kyogre's attack before it falls asleep at the end of the turn. From there, I swap out into Nidorino as Kyogre stays snoozing. And fortunately for me, it stays asleep for another couple turns, allowing me to take it out with a few rounds of Double Kick. Now in the randomization table for the gym leaders, it's not quite all legendaries. A few of them are some of the strongest regular Pokemon out there, including Aggron, for which Nidorino happens to be particularly equipped to take out with a couple of quad-effective Double Kicks, granting us our second gym badge. With Lombre gone, we need a new member for the team, and in Ilex Forest, I run into an Azurill. And with the static ability, this thing might just be Peekaboo. And since the level caps are so close between Azalea and Goldenrod, I accidentally overlevel Nidorino. For that reason, I go ahead and explore Route 35, where I find myself a Budu with the download ability. And so, after I once again cycle like a maniac to gain friendship, after Azurill evolves into Meryl, we can immediately evolve it into Azumarill. We also get to knock out two birds with one stone since Budu also evolves through friendship into Roselia, which means the time has come to take on the crybaby of the century, the third gym leader, Whitney. And with only two Pokemon, she's 33% less daunting to take on than Bugsy, starting out with a Heatran, so I immediately swap out of Bernadetta into Azumarill, who doesn't have too hard a time taking out the Heatran with Bubble Beams. This leaves Whitney with only one Pokemon, a Slacking, and with the randomized ability, this thing is an absolute monster. However, I realize it only has one attacking move to its name, Feint Attack, which Lucario quad resists, which means the Slacking is easily disposed of. Obtaining the third badge so easily, my confidence was on the rise, especially when Whismer evolved to Loudred at level 20. Stop dancing such a serious dance. Show me something like a hula dance. Buddy, I don't think she's the kind of dancer that takes requests. From here, things are about to get a lot more difficult, facing the next gym leader, Morty, who has a total of 4 Pokemon. He leads with Mew as I send in Pure Power Bernadetta. Morty, naturally jealous of Bernie, immediately goes for Transform, but since Loudred's base defense is a pathetic 43, it immediately falls to what's effectively a 142 base attack stab Silk Scarf Headbutt. Azelf is next, hitting me with a Confusion, doing some decent damage since the base special defense of 43 isn't anything to write home about either, and we just barely fall short of taking it out with a Headbutt. So Morty heals up with a Hyper Potion, but this time the Headbutt is a slightly higher roll, taking out the Azelf. Morty's next Pokemon is Zapdos, which is incredibly terrifying, so expecting it to take me out with a Thunderbolt, I immediately swap out into Larvitar to dodge it with my immunity. Even so, it does pretty good damage with a resisted Pluck before I can fire off a super effective Rock Slide, which just barely falls short of doing half. So after another Pluck to avoid getting Zapdos into healing range, I go for a Bite just to push it over the edge. This means I need to take a third Pluck, leaving me at just 14 HP before I can send off another Rock Slide, which is gonna be enough to take out the Zapdos. This leaves Morty with one final Pokemon, which had to be a Ho-Oh. And despite Larvitar having the quad effective Rock Slide here, since I'm at such low health, I have to swap out into Azumarill, who eats a Brave Bird and just barely doesn't take half. We do get some free damage from Recoil, but more importantly, we actually get some value off of Static. This means that I'm faster the next turn and can go for a Surf to take Ho-Oh down to half. I'm then struck by another Brave Bird, which Azumarill survives on just 9 HP. And after Recoil, a Surf should be enough to win us the battle, but Ho-Oh ends up surviving on what must be like 1 HP, able to take out Azumarill with a Weather Ball. And just to rub it in, Morty undoes all that damage the next turn by healing up to full with a Hyper Potion. I do get to hit it with a free Thunderbolt, but it doesn't do as much damage as I was hoping since Nidoran Nidorino isn't exactly a special powerhouse. It then shows me the super effective extra sensory, which I didn't expect it to have, which almost takes out Nidorino. At such low health, I have to swap out, going out into Togetic, which actually takes the extra sensory quite well, allowing me to hit the Ho-Oh with an Aerial Ace the next turn before it hits me down into the red. I then swap out into one of my last healthy Pokemon, Lucario, as the Ho-Oh beautifully gets paralyzed on the switch, allowing me to finish off the fight with a headbutt the next turn. Which means we finally have a level cap over 30, allowing us to evolve our starter into Pupitar. And quickly it becomes time to take on the next challenge versus Leader Chuck. With only 2 Pokemon to his name, this man is usually a total pushover, but he ends up starting with Palkia. There's nothing on my team that outspeeds this, so there's no chance for me to switch out at all, but luckily Slash does less than half, allowing me to get off a headbutt. I've got a chance to crit the next turn because anything I switch in would just be destroyed the turn right after, but luckily I don't get crit and can destroy the Palkia with a second Pure Power headbutt. Of course he's got a Dialga. What is this guy, the Warden of Space and Time? At this level, however, Dialga doesn't quite have Earth Power yet, so I can fairly freely swap into Ike, who doesn't take too much from a Slash. The next turn I use a Force Palm, which is actually enough to take Dialga below half, activating its Citrus Berry to restore a bit of health. It then just uses Power Gem, revealing to me that this Dialga is basically no threat at all, and so I slap it into the history books. With 5 badges down, I started my journey towards Mahogany Town, picking up a few encounters on the way, first off an Electrike. And while Inner Focus isn't extraordinarily good, it doesn't really make Electrike any worse than it normally is. And as an added bonus, we can immediately evolve it into Manectric. I then head north towards the Lake of Rage, and on Route 43, I run into an Arbok with Drought. But what we're really looking to pick up is the red Gyarados from the Lake of Rage, randomized into any shiny Pokemon at level 30. And my encounter ends up being Shiny Larvitar. Now this encounter does conflict a bit with the Species Clause, a Nuzlocke rule that I always play with, which states you may only use 1 Pokemon of each evolutionary line in any given run. However, in this case, the Species Clause is overwritten by the Shiny Clause, which states you can use a shiny Pokemon even if you've already found a Pokemon in that area. And to try to adhere to both of these rules as closely as possible, I'll just replace my old one with a new one. But this thing is more than just a shiny new upgrade, coming with the Speed Boost ability, one of the strongest abilities in the game. And we can of course immediately evolve it into Shiny Pupitar. Dragonite Hyper Beam. Please, I just work here. Lance, what the f— With Team Rocket disposed of, we need to make our preparations to take on Price, and since we've received a Moonstone from our mom, we can finally evolve Nidorino into Nidoking. Going up against Price, our team is finally looking somewhat usable. With fully evolved Pokemon, we may stand a chance yet. But going up against Regigigas without its slow start ability is terrifying, and the idea that it might have Ice Punch scares me out into Lucario, which it ends up actually having. The resisted hit barely does anything to Lucario, who uses Force Palm the next turn, doing over half to Regigigas and getting the paralysis. But with my luck, of course Regigigas has Flame Body burning us, so we won't be able to get the KO the next turn. Now that Lucario won't get the KO, I decide to swap out into Manectric, who gets hit by a Fire Punch on the switch, so I'm very glad I swapped out. The Fire Punch also ends up getting a burn, which isn't as big a deal since Manectric is a special attacker and can finish off the Regigigas the next turn with Wide Lens Thunder. That's 1 Pokemon out of the way, but we did get 2 of our Mons severely hurt and statused. Giratina is such a threat, I decided to just go for Thunder Wave, even though that means sacrificing Manectric. However, we do end up getting the full paralysis. Expecting the Earth Power, I definitely want to preserve Manectric, swapping in my Togetic, but I end up just being immune to the Shadow Sneak instead. This works out perfectly since I can Encore the Giratina into Shadow Sneak and start Charming to lower its attack as much as possible. After that, I try to get some damage, but my only attacking move on Chrom is Flamethrower, which barely does anything as a resisted hit. So after reapplying an Encore, this time to Dragon Claw, I swap out into Lucario to try and deal some meaningful damage. However, of course things don't go to plan, and the Giratina immediately gets a critical hit, taking Ike down into the red with the burn. I really don't have many ways to get damage off on this thing, so I fire off a Shadow Ball anyway, but it does way less damage than I was hoping, and Lucario just goes down to Dragon Claw combined with burn. With Lucario gone, my options to damage this thing are terrible, so I need to get creative, encoring the Giratina into Dragon Claw again, then swapping out into Pupitar. And the only reason I can do this is because of the Encore, since the Giratina has Earth Power, which would immediately destroy me. The -6 Dragon Claws would barely do any damage, but we can try to avoid any crits by going for a Paraflinch strategy with Rock Slide. This strat almost takes me all the way, getting Giratina into the red before the Encore ends. Seeing his price is in healing range, I make a huge mistake here in not firing off another Rock Slide to just get more damage, and instead I swap into Chrom, which is incredibly stupid since Encore only has 5 PP and I've burned through them all. This means my only option is to try and chip Giratina down with as many flamethrowers as possible, which is doing barely any damage at all. And like any strategy that involves waiting out a huge number of turns, you're at greater risk of running into a critical hit, which is exactly what happens, taking out my Togetic. Since Loudred has no way of even touching this Giratina, I'm forced to send in Nidoking and go for an Ice Beam, which actually does some pretty decent damage, but then I just have to get taken out by an Earth Power. Or so I thought, but Nidoking survives like an absolute boss, firing off another Ice Beam, and Giratina gets paralyzed. This of course means instead of being taken out by an Earth Power, Nidoking takes out the Giratina the next turn with an Ice Beam. But sadly, Price is not quite out of it yet, sending in his final Pokemon, Entei. He goes for a Fire Spin, somehow just barely missing out on the KO, allowing me to fire back with a Surf, taking out half of Entei's health before Nidoking unfortunately goes down to Fire Spin. This means Price is now taken out half of our team, but at least we've got a pretty decent answer to Entei and Pupitar. Entei uses Flamethrower, but because it's resisted, it doesn't do too much damage, not even taking Xander below half, and we can use a Rock Slide to finish off the fight and claim our 6th gym badge. That was a lot to lose in one go. So once again, we're gonna need to go catch some new Pokemon. First off, heading to Ecruteak City, where I pick up a Tailo. Flame Body's not a bad ability to have, and I'm definitely glad to have Swellow on the team. Next, I head back to Goldenrod to pick up what's usually an Eevee, but in this case, it's randomized into a Venomoth. And while adaptability's great, Venomoth doesn't really get too many bug and poison type moves. I head west from Cyanwood to the Cliff Cave where I pick up a Monferno. It may have Unburden, but because the level cap is only at 35, it's gonna have to ride the bench, which gets us ready to take on the 7th gym leader, Jasmine. Our team's looking a lot less impressive than when we took on Price, so I'm pretty afraid of what's about to go down. But at least we can immediately take out our first Pokemon, Shaman, with a Fly from Swellow. Now in a normal run of Heartgold Soulsilver, all it takes to beat Jasmine is a competent ground type. But if you can't beat him, join him, since she's got a Sandstream Groudon. Ingrid really wants nothing to do with this thing, so I immediately go for a U-turn to get a little bit of chip damage before I can swap out into Venomoth. Groudon then uses Bulk Up on the switch, which is terrifying. Realizing I basically stand no chance against this thing unless I status it, I go for a Poison Powder, which will get us residual damage on the Groudon, but it comes at the unfortunate steep cost of Venomoth's life. You had a short stay on the team, but you played a very important part. I unfortunately don't have a Grass, Water, or Ice type to deal any good damage to this thing, so I start off by going into Arbok to set up the Sun to get rid of the chip damage from Sandstorm. This lets me swap around a lot more freely to dodge Earthquakes with immunity and take resisted hits until the Groudon goes down to poison. This just leaves Jasmine with our final Pokemon, Melodic, so a quick U-turn out into Manectric and one Thunder later, and we've got our 7th gym badge. With the level cap now at 41 and a spot open on the team, we can evolve Monferno into Infernape. Oh, you managed to get this far? You mean past your, 10 grunts? Like Giovanni's done before me, I will disband Team Rocket here today. Okay, way to follow in a loser's footsteps, buddy. I then finally get to evolve Bernadetta into Pure Power Exploud, making it time to take on the final Johto gym leader, Claire, and I cannot believe we made it this far. And immediately, she starts out with a pretty underwhelming Gardevoir. And since I know I can take a Psychic, I stay in and go for an Aerial Ace to almost take out half of Gardevoir's health, as it just sets up a Calm Mind. Since another Aerial Ace won't get the KO, I go for U-turn instead, knowing it'll knock it out, but it also gives me the added benefit of swapping out into Bernadetta as well. I don't have a clue what's about to come in, but how can you go wrong with Pure Power Exploud? Especially when her second Pokemon is a Latios that just tries to go for Protect twice and gets insta-KO'd by Crunch, which means we've pretty effortlessly taken out half of Claire's team already. But her second half is a lot stronger, starting with Moltres with Drought to power up its Fire-type moves. I really can't stay in against a Stab Sun-boosted Flamethrower, so I elect to swap out into Pupitar instead, who can tank it fairly well above half health. This makes this strategy a lot safer in case we end up missing a Rock Slide, but first I go for Protect just to get myself a speed boost in order to outspeed the Moltres the next turn. However, I do end up connecting with the quad effective Rock Slide, which is of course gonna be enough to take out the Moltres in one hit. Claire then reveals her final Pokemon, which of course had to be an Arceus. And like every other Sinnoh legend, for some reason this thing has Earth power, so I swap out into Ingrid to dodge it with my flying type. Barring a critical hit, I can survive a Hyper Voice from this thing, which means I can go for kind of an odd strategy. The plan is to try and get Swellow as low on health as possible to try and bait Arceus into going for extreme speed. This means that when we switch to Arbok, it'll get hit with a physical move and that way transfer its Sticky Barb to do damage every single turn to Arceus. What I didn't know upon executing this strategy is that Sticky Barb doesn't always get transferred on contact. So on top of Arbok taking damage at the end of the turn from Sticky Barb, it also just gets immediately destroyed by another extreme speed the next turn. So that was a bit of a waste of Arbok's life. That means I'm forced to move on to plan B, Choice Scarf Infernape, which can at least fire off a super effective close combat to almost take out the Arceus, but it's not quite enough. Which means that after I get my defenses lowered, I can easily be taken out in one hit by Arceus, but for some reason it goes for Gravity. Realistically, falling short of that KO should have probably cost me my Infernape, but instead we can just fire off another close combat, taking out the Arceus and granting us the final Johto Gym Badge. Get wrecked, Claire. Admit defeat and confer the Rising Badge.
I don't wanna. Miss Johto's a bit.
Or must I inform Lance of this?
Here, this is the Rising Badge. Hurry up, take it.
And so, with the Rising Badge in hand, I head over to Route 48 where I find a Snow Warning Gibble, which I immediately evolve into Gabite. I also bring Roselia out of the box to evolve into Roserade, which means my Elite Four team consists of Ingrid, the Flame Body Swellow with Fly, Quick Attack, Aerial Ace, and U-Turn. Kagetsu, the Inner Focus Manectric with Flamethrower, Thunderwave, Thunder, and Thunderbolt. Hortensia, the Download Roserade with Growth, Giga Drain, Stun Spore, and Sludge Bomb. Ferdinand, the Unburden Infernape with Flamethrower, Mach Punch, Close Combat, and Stone Edge. Bernadetta, the Pure Power Exploud with Return, Brick Break, Ice Fang, and Crunch. And finally, Celica, the Snow Warning Gabite with Earthquake, Substitute, Stone Edge, and Dragon Claw, which of course evolves at level 48, meaning we can't have a Garchomp going into the Elite Four, but we can get as close as humanly possible. That way, through the experience share, we can guarantee that we have a Garchomp as long as we can defeat Elite Four member Will. Or in this case, Champion Will, since he's guaranteed to be stronger than any champion out there. And we can immediately get the upper hand by instantly taking out Dragonite with a quad-effective Ice Fang from Bernadetta. This immediately gets us the experience we need to evolve Gabite, as Will then sends in his second Pokemon, Regirock, which gets turned into rubble by a couple of Brick Breaks from Bernadetta. Will then sends in Jirachi, which is a pretty big problem since Bernadetta's at pretty low health, so I'm forced to swap out, going into Ingrid. She takes a pretty substantial amount from Psychic, but it's necessary that I swap her in. You see, Gabite isn't quite able to one-shot through Jirachi's massive 100 base defense and HP, so first I need Ingrid to come in and go for a U-turn to chip for about 20% before I send in Celica. Ingrid did outspeed, so Celica does have to take a Psychic on the switch here, but she's got enough special defense to tank it. The Jirachi of course gets the 1% chance to get 2 special defense drops in a row before I outspeed with Celica and take it out with a single Earthquake. The one thing that kinda sucks about bringing in Celica is that now I've set up the Hail, meaning that all of my Pokemon are gonna take a bit of chip damage at the end of every single turn. And because of this, I can't really reliably go for any Focus Sash strats in the future. Regardless, my next opponent is Regigigas, which Ferdinand can just come in and take out with a close combat, leaving Will with just one Pokemon Manaphy, so all I have to do is swap out into Roserade and take it out with a Giga Drain, meaning we finally have ourselves our Garchomp. Second in the Elite Four is the Ninja Master Koga, who leads off with a Heatran, which Ferdinand can take out with a single close combat. But things get a lot more dangerous when he sends in his second Pokemon, Kyogre. I'm expecting a Muddy Water here, so I immediately swap out into Kagetsu and pray to every single RNG god out there that I don't get my accuracy lowered. Luckily that doesn't happen, but more to the point, luckily I survive at all. Also, to give Roserade a bit more legroom to use Stun Spore and Growth, I swap the choice specs over to Kagetsu, which in this case works out well since we can one-shot the Kyogre with a Thunder. But it also means we're completely unable to do anything against the incoming Flygon and are forced to swap out. So I dodge the Earthquake with Ingrid and then go for a U-turn for a bit of damage as I swap out into Ferdinand. The Flygon just sets up Sandstorm, so I can easily knock out the remainder of its health the next turn with a close combat. The next Pokemon is then Mamoswine, which is conveniently a one-hit KO with close combat as well. Finally, we have to deal with Scizor, but since I'm Choice Scarf locked into close combat and have my defenses lowered sword so much, I decide to pivot out into Bernadetta and swap back into Fernandad to take it out with a flamethrower. Bruno is third, but for this type of randomizer, his team was incredibly overwhelming and very easily overcome, which leaves us with one Elite Four member to face, Karen. She leads off with the incredibly bulky Cresselia as I send in Bernadetta. She hits me with a stab psychic, which barely does anything before I can fire back with a return that almost gets the KO, which leads me to believe that I probably don't have full power on it. This of course leads Karen to go for a full restore, but another return just brings it right back down. And so after tanking another psychic, Bernadetta can finish the job. Karen then sends in Gyarados, so I swap in Kagetsu to tank a Hydro Pump, which it survives on 69 HP, and then can take it out with a Thunderbolt. Karen then has a Garchomp of her own, which is of course a massive problem for an electric type like Kagetsu, so I immediately swap out into my own Garchomp. Unfortunately for Karen, however, she has the level up move Dig, whereas I have the TM Earthquake, able to take out the Garchomp with a double power Earthquake since the other Garchomp's underground. Her last two Pokemon are then Salamence and Latios, which Garchomp can easily take out with a couple of Dragon Claws, meaning that we've made it all the way through the Elite Four without losing one of our 6 party Pokemon. But we still need to defeat the baddest of them all, the embodiment of corruption himself, Champion Lance. This man has become the most prominent evildoer in all of Kanto and Johto, and we've got to put a stop to that. Immediately we're given the upper hand as he shows us Metagross, which we can take out in one hit with a stab flamethrower from Ferdinand. Lance then shows us Deoxys, which I have no good switch in for whatsoever, so I decide to just send in Ingrid, hoping he'll go for a status move, but since he saw the KO with Psychic against Infernape, there's no chance and we just get taken out. I then send in Bernadetta, and the Deoxys, I guess not seeing the kill, sets up with a Cosmic Power to boost its defense and special defense. This gives me the opportunity to go for a super effective Crunch, and with Pure Power, it's actually enough to take out Deoxys through the defense boost. And then, of course, Lance has to have my arch nemesis of a Pokemon, Giratina. And completely forgetting that this thing gets Aura Sphere, I stay in like an idiot. Exploud does have pretty respectable defenses, however, and a pretty good HP stat of 104, allowing me to survive and fire off a Crunch, which does some pretty good damage, over half to the Giratina. Since another Aura Sphere would just take us out here, however, I need to swap out and go into Celica, which sets up the Hail and can tank the Aura Sphere fairly well. I can then outspeed with a Dragon Claw, which is gonna be enough to take out the remaining health of Giratina. But Lance is far from giving up, showing us the Rayquaza. Unfortunately for him, however, Rayquaza only has a base speed of 95 versus Garchomp's 102. And while we outspeed, we unfortunately can't quite take it out, meaning Rayquaza gets us with a Dragon Claw. And losing Garchomp, most likely our strongest Pokemon, is pretty huge, so I need to improvise, sending in Bernadetta and expecting Lance to go for a healing item. This gives us a free turn to go for whatever move we want, so I go for the quad effective Ice Fang, but of course the Rayquaza is holding a Yache Berry to decrease Ice Fang's power. And because of this, the Rayquaza actually manages to survive the Ice Fang. Lance, however, then predictably goes for a second full restore, allowing us to go for Ice Fang again, and this time Rayquaza's already consumed its Yache Berry, allowing us to take it out. And while that's true, as well as the fact that we survived Life Orb on 3 HP, we did set up the Hail with our own Garchomp, which unfortunately is gonna be the demise of Pure Power Exploud. But the fight still isn't over. Lance has 2 more Pokemon, so I decide to send in my Scarfed Infernape as he shows me Darkrai. And if we weren't Choice Scarf, we would have most certainly probably been put to sleep by Dark Void. However, in this case, we can just fire off a super effective close combat and take it out in one shot, leaving Lance with only 1 Pokemon left, Tyranitar, and I can't think of a better move to be locked into than close combat when facing off against a Tyranitar, which means that even though it took losing half of our team to get here, we managed to finally beat Designer Lance. And while this means that we've conquered the Johto region, it's not quite the end of the challenge. And even though we've lost half of our team, we still have 1 good spare in the box, which we can evolve into Shiny Tyranitar. From there, we head over to Olivine to set sail for the Kanto region. Here, we've got plenty of routes to look through for eligible encounters, and on Route 8, I find myself a Bagon. And listen, we may have lost our Pure Power Exploud, but Pure Power Bagon is certainly a respectable replacement. I mean, seriously, Pure Power Salamence, it's an effective base attack stat of 270, stronger than anything in the game. Then on my way to Cinnabar, I pass through Route 21, where I manage to run into a Haunter. I then start tearing through gym leaders, and getting to be close to level 60 against all these guys means that it's incredibly easy to make it all the way to Blue. And with all the Kanto badges collected, we only have one fight left. So I begin by evolving my Haunter into Gengar, thus having assembled a pretty respectable team to take all the way up to the summit of Mount Silver. Red is a formidable opponent, and I decided to only level to 84 to match most of his Pokemon, which is gonna make it that much harder that his level 88 Pokemon happens to be Arceus. It does, however, only have normal type moves to attack with as well as Future Sight, so I can fairly freely swap into Gengar. As long as I can keep track of the turns for Future Sight, I should be doing okay, and I decide to burn the Arceus with Will-O-Wisp. The final move on this thing is Recover, which is going to make it that much more difficult to take it out. At least it outspeeds Gengar, allowing me to take it down below half at the end of the turn. From here, I know I'm going to be hit with a Future Sight, so I have to swap out, deciding to switch into my Dark-type Tyranitar. Arceus heals up most of its health with Recover, and at the end of the turn, I learn something truly terrifying. Future Sight deals typeless damage instead of Psychic, which means it's able to hit Dark types, which Tyranitar only narrowly survives. Now that the Future Sight is dealt with, however, I can swap Gengar back in against an Extreme Speed. Arceus then goes for Future Sight, however, because of the burn last turn, it is below half health, allowing me to take it out with a Focus Blast, given that I connect, which I fortunately end up doing. Red then sends in his second Pokemon, a Groudon, which changes the snow to a sandstorm. And because Gengar doesn't have Levitate, Groudon can easily take us out with a ground move, so I swap into Lucina to dodge it with my flying type. This next turn is the turn when Future Sight will hit at the end, so I decide to go for Fly, which not only allows me to dodge Groudon's Eruption, but also the Future Sight. I unfortunately missed the Fly, but that's besides the point. A consequence of this is that I do have to deal with a full power Eruption from Groudon since it's at full health, but it's resisted, so it barely does anything. So, in order to not have to deal with Fly's imperfect accuracy, I decide to go for Dragon Claw instead, which does do over half to the Groudon, meaning it severely powers down its Eruption, which already wasn't doing that much damage. And from there, another Dragon Claw seals the deal. So, with our entire team intact, Red shows his third Pokemon, Dialga. I'm expecting the Dragon move here, so I swap out into Kagetsu since I really don't have a good switch, as the Dialga goes for a Flash Cannon, which just barely misses out on doing half. I then try to get some damage with a flamethrower, but it really doesn't do too much to Dialga since it's incredibly bulky, and a second Flash Cannon is unfortunately enough to take out Kagetsu. Unfortunately, Dialga isn't quite done there, as I fire off a close combat from Infernape, which isn't quite enough to take it out, leaving it deep in the red and allowing it to finish off Ferdinand with an Earth Power. And just like that, Red has already swung the battle back to a 4 versus 4. And from here, it's pretty obvious that Red is going to heal up with a full restore, so I send in Tyranitar and go for an Earthquake, which does just above half and gets us a speed boost at the end of the turn. This allows me to follow up with another Earthquake, taking out the Dialga and getting us to +2 speed, which ends up being incredibly important since Red's next Pokemon is a Shaman Sky, which we only outspeed because of those boosts and can take out in one hit with a Stab Rock Slide. Of course, Red has Rayquaza too, and there's no chance we're knocking this thing out with a single Rock Slide, so I go ahead and swap out into Roserade. And unfortunately, this switch isn't particularly long-lived. While Roserade actually manages to survive the Dragon Claw on 12 HP, it suffers Anakin Skywalker's worst imaginable fate and gets taken out by the sand. But that sacrifice certainly wasn't in vain, since we can now get Lucina in for free and outspeed with a pure power Dragon Claw, which is way more than enough to one-shot. Finally, Red has one Pokemon left, a Mewtwo. And expecting it to destroy me with a Psychic, I can swap into Xander, who this time is immune with its Dark type. And unfortunately for Red, it seems like he's been randomly given a choice item, meaning he's locked into Psychic and we can freely fire off a Stab Crunch, which just falls short of getting the KO. However, we can't forget that Red set up his own Sandstorm with Groudon, which ends up being his downfall. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I beat a Pokemon Soulsilver Randomizer Hardcore Nuzlocke versus some of the strongest Pokemon to ever exist. So let me remind you that if you made it this far into the video and you're not subscribed to the channel, Lance is gonna get you.